Welcome and greetings from Treaty 1 territory. So, my name is Carla, and I'm your host for our webinar series for our data sovereignty area here at the First Nations Health and Social Secretariat in Manitoba. We did have a series that had went on with every month on the last Thursday of each month where a topic was talked about. And so the month of November, we do have some amazing people joining us doing some great work. We are going to be talking about Archives 101. So we'll hear from Floyd first, and then we'll hear from Heather and Krystal next. And if you do have any questions, there is a chat box below, a Q&A. Please do not hesitate to send some questions there, and we could ask. But we'll hand it over to Floyd to get started. And
Oh,
once again, in the chat box, if you could put your name and where you're calling from, and I'll just share Floyd's screen from the. Go ahead, Floyd.
okay. Um, how? Good morning. Why use sign is so it's good morning. Yukiska. Why use sign is through our researches we were able to revive the Plains Indian Sign Language, which had all but disappeared in our area, if not in this whole province, well, this colonial province. And so through our researches, we were able to revive it by bringing an expert sign language speaker from Montana. And so now we use it. But it had not entirely disappeared. You could see traces to this day from when people talk Cree, they use a lot of their gestures. They still use gestures. That's part of the Plains Indian Sign Language lexicon. And then I had seen fragments of it when I was a boy because my grandmother, that's how you say grandmother. My grandmother, she was deaf, and so she used a lot of signs. But it wasn't until much later that I understood what she was doing was using plain Indian sign language as an indigenous deaf speaker. So that's one of the beneficiaries of our research has been the indigenous deaf community locally, because they were only being taught ASL to communicate, but now they attend our workshops and they're able to talk Indian language, indigenous sign language. I just wanted to put that out there, and as one of the beneficial results of our own researches. This I'll continue. So first of all, this photo you see here was circulating on Facebook. It was from Duck Lake Indian Residential School, 1896 was the caption. Now, my grandfather, he was in Duck Lake in 1896. My grandfather, Thomas Favel. And that was the same year Almighty Voice, he was killed by the police with a cannon nearby in a bluff. And my grandfather had said they were locked in the school during that event, tragic event, but they could hear the sound of the cannons. Like, I guess they shelled that poplar bush all day when they killed Almighty Voice and his two companions, his two friends. And so this photo was circulating unnamed, just that was Duck Lake. And so then I also found a list of, I was shared a list of the Duck Lake Indian Residential School students of 1896. And by my cousin, Debbie Cameron from Beardees, that was her research. And she had a list of names. And so on these names was Chief Poundmaker's son, who became deceased there. And also my grandfather, and then his brother, who was deceased at the school as well. This was information that our own band members did not know, our own family members did not know. And and um, and so this is the steps we took, the different collaborations to come up with that kind of information, and which we present here at our museum, our own Indigenous museum here on our reserve. Next picture. This is a Cheyenne man. His name was White Bull. He's using sign language. He's talking about the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876 down in Montana Territory. Well, it was actually Crow Indian and Lakota territory. The Crows said it was their land and their territory, and Lakotas moved in. So that was part of their dispute. But through the sign language, it's through the sign language that that I wanted to show that once again, to speak about sign language, which was in common use up in this part of Turtle Island, all the way from the Arctic down to Mexico. Case in point, this is sign language for yes. Uh-huh. I just heard from a friend of mine from Mexico. I guess in Mexico, they use that for yes too, but they go, I guess, so they say C, 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 C. So I thought, very interesting. Culturally, they speak much, but even their sign language adapted to how they speak. Next slide. This is one of probably the only copies of a calendar that the great artist Alan Sapp made in 1967, before he became famous. He had been commissioned by a local store owner to paint a picture of Big Bear, and for a calendar. So Jack Bishop, he had a store here near Gallivan, just off the reserve here, just a store, not even a village, just a store, where people from Sweetgrass and Poundmaker, they go there and shop and buy things. But in these captions there, what I say there is Big Bear is buried here on Poundmaker. The reason we say that is my aunt, she was raised by Big Bear's son, Horsechild, or Joe Bimmy. And so, because she was an orphan, he raised her, and he used to go to that graveyard once a year, and he'd smoke a pipe there. And that was on our graveyard here on Poundmaker. However, the next reserve, Little Pine, say Big Bear is buried on their reserve. Now, here is a case in point where it's not to call each other liars, but what I say is all oral history is correct. So ours says this, because my aunt told that to me. So I say what I repeat is what my aunt told me, and what her children tell me, and what other elders told me. They went there. So, but I'm not saying the other reserve was wrong. So that's the other thing about data sovereignty, is what I find is in historical discourse, people try to disprove each other, but I don't. Next picture. This is a picture I found in an old paper about, sorry for the glare on the picture, about the creation of the Federation of Saskatchewan Indians back in the late 50s, mid 50s. These are at that time there was a pass system in place in the West here, and so somehow they were able to meet. They were prohibited from getting lawyers, but somehow I wanted to capture this for my community of what it took to organize back in the day. Next picture. In the next picture, Yeah, there's in the next picture, if we can change the picture. Yes, here, my grandfather, he was the last lifetime chief here on Poundmaker. We only had elections here in the early 70s when he became too old to govern because he was born in 1886. I have an obituary here of his own father, Basil Favel, who fought here at the Battle of 1885 on May 2nd. That's him in the picture. That was his father. Basil, in our researches, was a Assiniboine Métis. His mother was from Wood Mountain, and his father was from Winnipeg. His grandfather is buried in Lockport, Maine, in Lockport, Manitoba, just north of Winnipeg. Basil, he was a traditional Indian, though, however, he sang in that battle, the night of the battle. When they won, they celebrated. And Basil, oral history they told me he sang there, opened the powwow that night. And oral history told me he killed 5 soldiers during that battle. 8 soldiers were killed, but he killed 5 of them. So at that time, they were afraid to talk. Um, at that time, they were afraid to talk about things like that, what I just showed to you, because my grandfather, the chief, I guess he used to tell our relatives in Cree, don't say too much about things, you might get somebody in trouble. Because they were afraid of imprisonment and hanging, because 8 warriors were hung here, 1885. And my grandfather would have been, my great grandfather would have been in jail with them when they were hung, these people. The other thing through the researches we found is when Basil Favel was interviewed in 1936 as an elderly man, he said, this reserve Poundmaker is Assiniboine people. That's what he said. I shared that research with my band members. They're surprised. All this time, they thought we were Cree people, Nehiawak. I guess historically we were Assiniboine people who became acculturated by the Cree. So and so from there, I always tell people, Cree is not um, an ethnicity. It's not a blood. Cree is a culture and a language that, because an example is our community here, which we're Assiniboine, but now we are Cree. So with our language, with our ceremonies, with our worldview, with our Atayokeone, our sacred stories, we are fully Cree Indians, like Cree First Nations in our, but historically, and that was through our research, through my great grandfather, Basil Favel. And this other picture right here on the side on the far left is my grandfather with his nephew, John Tutusis, sitting in front of the Premier Tommy Douglas, sometime late 50s, early 60s. This was the discussion at Fort San about Indigenous people being allowed to vote. I think it happened in 1961. So we have pictures from that time frame, and okay. And so next picture, I'll talk. I'll give an overview later. I'm just talking directly now. This is our chief here. His name was Chief Poundmaker. When he got out of prison in 1886, the warriors, they went to meet him at the train station. They told him, no use coming back here. There's nothing here. Your family's broken up. We have no guns. We have no horses. We're starving. You might as well go to your adopted father, Crowfoot, down in Alberta. No use for you to come here. So he did. So from there, eyewitness testimonies of his death. He died in a feast in the Blackfoot Crossing early July, just overlooking the Bow River. I seen that place. I went there, and one of those elders told me this is where the feast was, he said. and not far away is where they buried him. According to these documents, he came with 7 people when he went traveling down there, and that's all that. Along with there was just a handful of them when he was buried, and there was no big celebration when he was buried there. Crowfoot was there, along with his 2 family members, and then his people, the ones who came with Poundmaker. And I'm just, once again, I'm only telling you this not to educate us only about Poundmaker, promote Poundmaker, but as an example that other communities can go through in their own communities, creating their own research and their own data. Everything I'm sharing here was not public information. We dug it up. It was not public, it was obscure, unknown, but the obscure and the unknown, we have made it public for our people to learn. Next picture. Here's Big Bear's son, Joe Bimi, is on the upper left, horse child. In that center picture, he's that little boy. Horse child, or Joe Bimi, lived on our reserve here, on our community. He raised a lot of children, adopted children. He raised a lot of children, and my aunt, my late uncle Henry Favel, his wife, the wife, she was raised by him, and so that's where I get some of my information is from that family. That's their information they shared with me. This is time for talking with me, like that. And Big Bear's other son, Imses, or Little Bear, he went to Rocky Boy, Montana, and he eventually became a chief there. So those are pictures there. In the middle picture is Charles M. Russell, the famous Western artist, who advocated for Rocky Boy's people to have a reserve. And I think they finally had one in 1916, some abandoned land there. Up until then, they lived on the outskirts of towns, cities, and it's said they often lived off the garbage dump. That's what I heard. That's what I was told too orally, and that's what I read.
Floyd, we do have a question. The question is,
Yes.
how can we ask for questions if some of our elders don't want to talk about it or if it's lost?
That's a tough one because I was in that situation often. And when the information was lost, I dug it up myself in my own, at my own time, at my own interest. But also, I also had heard a lot when I was young from elders who used to visit my parents. So I already knew some history that was not being talked about. And if they don't want to share, I guess uh, you have to find a bridge with them, which is gifts, dinner, friendship. You'd have to gain their trust. That's all I could say is like which is what the process I always undergo with elders is you gain their trust and with the proper protocol as well. But a lot of some elders, they're not traditional and they don't accept tobacco or something. But still, it's good to give. You can always tell them, give it to somebody who smokes, but here's our gift. And the only reason you give tobacco is that was the first plant created on Mother Earth during the time of creation. It comes first. So that's how you give a tobacco. And that's what tobacco's role is. Now the tobacco, he was a handsome man, they said. He was a being. He was blessed by being turned into a tobacco. Now he goes and tells the Great Spirit what's going on here, what this dialogue and conversation, and he goes and tells the Great Spirit. And so now the Great Spirit listens to what's going on down there. That's the only reason we give tobacco. So trust tobacco and take it from there, and also try find your own research. And because of colonization, we can't create obstacles. We can't allow obstacles to stop us. Um, And so find a way around it, and not to blame elders by saying, oh, they don't want to share, but find a way around it. And we got to understand colonization did a lot of damage to our people.
I do have another question. How do you access information that is not public?
Through friendship and trust and conversations. And then I don't write it down. So for example, all the data we have here on Poundmaker, I share some of it on the walls here. I'm in the museum right now. Sometimes people give it to me. They gave me the whole family history of Poundmaker right here, right behind me, of one to me, and then so that's how I access. They give it to me, or I share it. But I also I don't want to make it public, make it too easy, because when people come here, I often tell them most of what I'm going to tell you, you're not going to find in a book. I said, white people wrote a lot of our things, and they created misconceptions, and they still do to this day. So that's why, for the moment, I don't write it down. It's oral, but some I post on the walls. Next picture. Yes, keep up the questions. Like, I hope I answer them as. Once again, here's that picture I had shown you earlier of the abused looking boys with their priests. And here's a list of names that match up to the same year, Duck Lake. So it could be that my grandfather is in here. It could be that Poundmaker's son is in here. The gray eyes people from Muskeg, their names. So it could be, but we don't know. All we can do is put them up side by side. Maybe if somebody comes here to look, they can see the names, they could see the picture, maybe they'll make a connection, maybe that's their relative. So that's an example of some of the things we do. Next picture. This is the written testament of Keith Kamakotel, who was a boy during the battle May 2nd, 1885. His granddaughter, no, his daughter, Josephine Frank, that family gave me the written testimony of Josephine Frank, what her father said about the May 2nd, 1885 battle here. So this is the grandchildren gave me the letters, photocopied. I printed them and put them on board, and I put it here. You're not going to find this testament in any book, published book by any white publishers, colonial publishers, I would say. So that's this unique information that comes from our community and our people. Next picture. Oh, this is a band list of 1885. That again, my cousin Debbie Cameron from Duck Lake, Beardees Reserve. She gave me this band list of who were our band members, because it's just to provide information for all of our band members. They need info. They want to do archival work, but they don't know how, or they have no info. I try to provide some info, and I post it on the wall. It's not tucked away in some book. I post basic information on the walls, sort of like a display or an art installation. Next. Exoneration. Chief Poundmaker was exonerated in 2019. We began the process here My cousin Blaine Favel was the chief in 1994. He submitted a request to Justice Minister Alan Rock at that time. It was rejected. We revived it again in 2018 or 2017, the exoneration, to have him exonerated. The reason is, according to our oral history, Poundmaker did not commit treason and any insurrection. We were attacked, and we were not part of a Métis Northwest Rebellion. We were not part of that. And we were only starving, and we went to Battleford to ask for food in fulfillment of treaty promises. That's all. So that was our oral history, which we brought forward. And then from there, the government listened, and we managed to change history. Next picture. Custer's last stand. Our research documented tells us Plains Cree were present at this battle. Next picture. Again, segregation, apartheid in this province, a sit-in because Indians were not allowed to eat in this restaurant in North Balford. Next picture. And a high winter count, one ye tu happy. This is our original Data Sovereignty Archives library, right here. Next picture. Okay, I guess that's it. So I'm going to wrap up, spend the last minute wrapping up. Yes, I just wanted to give a brief overview what we do and possibly how this could possibly relate to your own communities and your own interest in reviving and keeping your own history. And you don't need the recognition of the colonialists to say you are right. Our history was right all the time, and we just promote it. Thank you, and I don't want to take up anybody else's time. And so my time is over. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Okay, so awesome. Thank you so much, Floyd, for sharing. And good news, I just asked just before we came on here for Floyd to be a keynote at our conference. So exciting. If you do have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. We could ask them at the end. We do have a little bit of a time. But with that, we'll switch to Heather and Krystal and give them time to do a introduction and to share as well. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box.
Krystal, did you want to start?
Yeah, I can start. Sorry, my computer didn't want to unmute. Can everyone see my screen okay? I have a new laptop and it's a little wonky, folks. So if anything happens, please let me know. So my name is Krystal Payne. I am the repatriation archivist at the University of Manitoba Archives and Special Collections. Heather, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, sure. My name's Heather Bidzinski, and I'm the head of archives and special collections at the University of Manitoba.
So I'm working on the repatriation project, which is related to the formal apology that the University of Manitoba did in June this year, related to the history of inappropriate acquisition and housing of Indigenous ancestral remains, burial belongings, and cultural heritage without consent. So at the archives, we have been going through collections and identifying Indigenous content and trying to imagine and put into action better ways of stewarding that material, much of which is new and undecided at this point, but it is something that we have started working on. So today we are going to talk about what an archive is. We'll talk about some archives terminology. We're also going to do a bit of a search. So Heather is going to lead us through how to use some archival search tools, which are different archive to archive. And we'll also leave some tools and resources. We will be sharing our slides with Carla, so if folks want them, you're welcome to have them. And feel free to ask questions throughout as well. So, what is an archive? An archive works to acquire, preserve, and make available material collected under the terms of a particular mandate, whether that be to document a community or business, to reflect government policies, or many other reasons. If you have a chance, it would be super helpful for me if you want to put in the chat if you've worked in an archive before or if you've researched in an archive before. This is kind of a wordy definition, but really what archives do is we try to make information very broad, available for the long term for people to access well into the future. So typically with an archive, when we're thinking of the future, we're thinking centuries, not a year or two or until the end of a project, typically. Although that can vary, there are many different types of archives that exist. You can find archives across the world, locally. We have the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation Archives. The City of Winnipeg has an archive. There's the Provincial Archive, which also houses the Hudson's Bay Company Archives, the Centre de Patrimoine, and Mennonite Heritage Archives, and more. Like the Aviation Museum has an archive, and you can find them in many places. At the bottom of the screen, there is a link to the Manitoba Archival Information Network, which will show you different repositories across the province, or different places where records are held. Nationally and internationally, plenty of archives as well. And archives typically serve different mandates. So they might work for an organization, might be like us, a university archive. They can be state archives. There can be community archives, all of which will collect slightly different things often. The difference between libraries and archives is that libraries typically have published materials, so books, periodicals, academic journals, newspapers, magazines. Typically, we would say those aren't unique and rare. Not always the case. There are rare books within libraries, of course, but often these are things that you can check out. You can take them home with you. You can take them off the shelf yourself, and you can walk to a table and go through them. Archives aren't really like that. And I just always, when I start, like to preface that archives are kind of strange places a lot of the time. They can seem kind of cold, they're often quiet, tables are often set up in rows. So they can be cold, kind of strange places. We at archives typically have unpublished records. We like to say that they're unique and rare, and that's because they are not published. You usually can't find them anywhere else. Again, not always true, but often when we collect records, we're looking for records that aren't available somewhere else. And they have to be consulted in person usually. So that might be now we have a lot more digitized records or records that were born digital and are available online. But typically, if you're looking at a paper record, you need to come in person. So I've kind of gone over this a little bit, but there are some pictures here about what kind of records the university archives holds. So there are some photos here. So archives will often have photos, maybe slides, maybe negatives also. Usually we will have some way of making these accessible to people. So maybe there will be like a slide reader that you can use to look at or a negative reader. Not always, but sometimes archives will have that. Maps, plans, and architectural drawings, born digital records, and textual documents. So getting into the nitty-gritty of archives, this is kind of what we do all day. Acquisition is referring to bringing materials into the archive. or when they're transferred to an archive. Usually that relates to what kind of archive you are. So an archive that is like a university archive where we work at, we will keep records relating to the university functions. They're often research records. And then we might also have special areas of collection as well that we keep. So every organization, every archive will probably have a slightly different collecting mandate. Arrangement and description is exactly what it says, arranging the materials into a certain order. We usually try to follow the order of the creator, and describing it as how we make it available. So we will write up something about each collection and make sure that people are able to then find that collection. Appraisal is determining the value, the archival value of the records. Sometimes people also refer to this as monetary appraisal, but often when archivists are talking about it, we're actually talking about, does this have archival value, which is a very subjective thing to think about. And what is considered to have archival value changes and shifts over time and place. So what one archive would think has archival value is not necessarily what another archive would think has archival value. Preservation and storage is keeping things at a sort of steady rate so that people can continue to access them into the future. Places have all sorts of different systems for doing that, and Heather's going to go through later a little bit about how to keep records as safe and stable as we can, sort of based on our own resources and what we can do. Reference and access is making those records available to people, so having a space online or in person for people to come and visit with those records and to use them. And then we have outreach. So outreach is any activity that promotes archives or archival records. So it looks different.
I do
That's
have a quick question. There was a
Yeah.
question about where would 60 Scoop survivors be able to find helpful information in an archive?
Yeah. Okay. So archives across the country are kind of like a labyrinth in that there are many places where 60 Scoop records might be held, and it will kind of depend on the agency that was responsible and where their records are held. So often these will be found in state records, but that could be at the national or the provincial level. So it might mean Library and Archives Canada, it might mean some of the provincial archives. They will all have slightly different ways to access as well. So I wouldn't ever want people to think that it's an easy thing to do, this research, especially records that are spread out across different archives. So one thing to think about with archival records that's really different than libraries is that when you're searching for an archival record, it's not based on a subject or a person necessarily. It's more based on who created it. So whenever you're thinking about a research question, where records about yourself too might be, you have to think about what organizations or agencies would have created those records and where are those records held. I'm not sure if that's a great answer, and I don't think it's a reassuring answer, but a lot of records relating to people are spread out across different places. Heather, would you add anything?
I would only add that some archives in Canada and perhaps in the United States as well are becoming more aware of people's desire to find these records. And so you will come across some archives that have created access guides to their collections that will help people looking for specific kinds of Indigenous content. I know the NCTR has a segment on their website dealing with 60 scoops, 60 scoop records. But it's not a matter of going to an archives and typing in 60 scoop and finding all of the content you're looking for. As Krystal mentioned, the records are interwoven with many different collections, and the root of the question needs to be who would have created the records that will have the information I'm looking for.
I do have another question that asks, what do you do with archives written in French?
Well, in our province, we actually do have an archival repository dedicated to the collection of Franco-Manitoban and French history in the province. So French records are collected and kept even in English institutions. Usually our descriptions of those records will indicate if the content is in a language other than English. So these records aren't put aside or not kept because they're in a different language. And often there are repositories dedicated to records within a language other than English. I hope that helps.
I do just want to go back to the 60 Scoop question because there is the 60 Scoop Healing Foundation, and they do have an archives committee or working group. I'm not entirely sure how that functions in their agency, but there are people who are working on all sorts of aspects of the records relating to the 60 Scoop. So in the university archives, we've been working on identifying Indigenous content, and part of that has been thinking about what sort of baskets we can think about information fitting into. So we have the university records, which are the official records of the university. We also then have a lot of private records as well. So these might be research records, organizational records, artist records, photographers' records, many different kinds. And we've been sorting them into different, what we're calling baskets, because categorization doesn't seem like a good term. But we have sort of sorted it into records that are about Indigenous people, records that have been made for or with Indigenous peoples, and then content by, so records that have been created by Indigenous people. Most archives, I think, from talking to other archivists, have similar sort of baskets they would put the records into. So as you're searching, there will be a wide variety of types of records and different ways information has been collected, which is just something to know going into doing a search, which Heather is going to get into now.
Thanks, Krystal. Just to add to that, in academic archives especially, so archives that are situated in universities or colleges, a lot of the Indigenous content about Indigenous people will have come to the archives through researchers. So in earlier records, before there were robust ethical processes in place, you may find a lot of content that I would describe as a settler as having been violently taken from community. So just one thing to keep in mind, that sometimes the content you're going to encounter will be difficult, it may be triggering, and it may be traumatic. And if you're concerned about those things, archivists are always here to help you mediate that relationship with the records. So Krystal has shared some key points about what archives are, what archivists do, and how we do it. And I'm going to get into a little bit about how you actually conduct research in an archives. And I would say, and this is coming from an archival standpoint, I'm an archivist, this is what I do every day, but I think one of the most challenging things about the the work we do in our collections is that our collections aren't organized intuitively or in a way that makes it easy to find things. Most people are familiar with going into a library and searching for things by subject, and that's not a way that you can access our content. So we do hope that in the next few minutes, sharing a few tricks of the trade will be able to make your research a little bit easier. There are really 3 key steps when you're beginning an archival search. You want to frame your questions so that you can get the best results. You want to understand how things are described in our archives and how they're organized using a tool we call a finding aid, and knowing what questions to ask before you visit in person. So next slide, please, Krystal. Now, just to walk you through a little bit of what that looks like, I am going to share my screen and walk you through a search on our digital collections page. So this is the homepage of Archives and Special Collections, and I'll try not to scroll too fast and make anybody motion sick. In our digital collections, you're presented in the front page with a whole bunch of information. And I'd like to show you a search for some Inuit content. So you can ask your question in a couple of different ways. It can be really broad, and you can get an awful lot of results, or you can narrow it down. So if I know I'm interested in Inuit art, and I'm actually really interested in female artists in the 1970s in Baker Lake, I'm going to start my search fairly broadly. So I'm going to type in Inuit art, and I see that that produces a whopping 2,418 results. I know that I actually am looking for photographs, so I'm going to narrow it down to that type of material. And as I mentioned, I'm looking for photographs in the 70s. So I'm going to be able to filter my results on the side to narrow down the dates. And now I've dropped from over 2,000 results to 106. I can further narrow that down by saying, you know what, I really actually want to look at photographs in Baker Lake. And I'm really interested in female artists. And I can see that I have not done my search correctly because my female artists are not coming up. And this is one of the challenges with doing searches in archives, because I've actually done this search about 5 different times today to make sure that it's going to come up with the results that we're looking for, and somehow it is not. So I'm going to go back one step here and see if I can find the photo that I'm looking for so that I can show you what it looks like. Inuit youth. All right, I'm going to start from scratch here. Still image. And what if we do Baker Lake? Nope. So there's something going on with our database right now that is not allowing me to find the photo that I'm looking for. That is one of the challenges of searching in archives, is that it doesn't always work out. So Krystal, if you could share your screen again, and I'll show you what I was looking for and why it should have worked. So I was looking for Inuit artists, and I was particularly looking for this photo of Janet Neepy, who was an Inuit artist in Baker Lake. So I used all the right search strings and couldn't find what I was looking for. But typically, if you start from the broad to the narrow, you should be able to find the material that you're looking for. If you know that there is something in the archives and it's not coming up in your search string, always ask an archivist, because we have some ways of going through the different search approaches to find what you're looking for. So in theory, if I filtered by date and by type of record that I was looking for, I should have come up with this photograph. I did not, however. So next screen, please. I like to use digital collections as an example because it's really visual, and you can see the photographs and you can sort of see your results coming up and weed through them visually. But most of the time you're going to be working with archival databases that are really text heavy, and they may or may not have digital files attached. One of the things that you may notice as you do your research is that archives are really hierarchical. We like to put things in different baskets based on the level of detail that we're using. We typically start with the biggest basket that we call fonds or collections. So that's the totality of the records we have from that particular person, and then we narrow it down. I like to compare it to menus to give you an analogy. So if you're comparing a menu, you could be looking at the biggest basket being the whole menu, and that's all the types of food and drink that a restaurant serves. And then that might be broken down by appetizers, mains, and desserts. So those would be what we call an archive series, the next smallest basket. And if you're looking for a snack, you might open the appetizer basket to see wings, nachos, and poutines, which would be our file basket. And finally, you might decide that barbecue sauced wings are the thing you're looking for, and that would be the item level. So it goes from the large to the small. Most archival records you'll find descriptions at the largest two baskets, the full and the series level. That's because archivists don't have the time and the resources to describe things at the item level. Next slide, please. And I see we have 2 minutes, so if you could just skip a couple of these slides, Krystal, because I think that the most important information is slide 15. So if you have questions about how to search archives, please reach out and ask us. But what we wanted to talk about a little bit is how to prepare for a visit. So always contact an archives in advance will help you out. Check the website. Archives typically will only allow you to use a pencil because pen can permanently damage the records. So there's all sorts of rules and regulations, and not everything that we have is online and not everything that we have is described. So often the best answer is to ask an archivist. Do you want to flip the slide, Krystal? Thank you. Some of the things, if you're looking to preserve the records of your community, the number one thing is a stable environment. So not everybody can create the temperature and humidity requirements that most large institutions have. But the biggest thing is to not have it fluctuate. So that's why we say attics and basements are never great places. They can get too hot, too cold, be exposed to too much light, too much humidity. As long as you can keep your conditions stable, that is going to be the best thing for your records. In terms of security, who can access your spaces and how? There are different supplies that you can use to process and care for your records. And then you want to find ways to make your collection discoverable. So you need to organize it and talk about it, describe it. You can put that in a database or you can put it on a spreadsheet. It doesn't have to be fancy. A place to work with the collection is ideal. So if you have a space where there's no food and drinks allowed so that you know you're not going to have different pests or damage to the records, and then making them available online is also a great option. And then sustainability. We need the people and the space and the finances to continue looking after our records. Is there anything you want to add, Krystal? Are you there, Krystal?
I am. It just
Okay.
didn't want to unmute. No, I have nothing to add there. So we may as well talk really quickly about these resources, I think. We have highlighted a very small selection of sort of starter resources for folks who are maybe interested in developing an archive for their organization or community, even your family. So there are some tips and tricks on these links that we have on this slide for how you might go about setting up an archive, taking care of archival records. Different associations will have different trainings and resources available as well. We've kind of tried to fit a lot into this 25 minutes. So yes, please do reach out if there are any questions about things that we maybe didn't get to today. And we will make sure the stuff is available as well for folks who want it.
Awesome. Thank you so much for both your presentations, to Floyd, to Krystal, to Heather. We truly appreciate it. There was one question which I'll open up to anybody to answer, but it was, how do we get more information on treaty documents? I understand the elders' history and stories, but what if we want to dig more deeper into our history? And I'll open it up if anyone would like to share.
Well, first of all, I think I'll interject here is regarding treaties. It's been established there's a big difference between the indigenous interpretation of history of a treaty, the oral, what came down orally, and what was written. It's been said the elders have said those are two different documents. It wasn't understood to be like that. So if one wants to get into it, I think there must be new research coming out that disputes the colonial interpretation of treaties. This is what a researcher would have to get into, is the new writings and documentation of the indigenous interpretation of history. And there is books out here. I have some books here at the library here, my library here.
Awesome. Are there any more questions? We'll take one more question before we end the session. You can put it in the chat box or you can put it in the Q&A. Okay, well, if someone is typing, what I'll do is I'll just say, if you'd like a copy of the presentation and the links, please send us an email to fnism.sovereignty@fnism.com. It's in the comment box, but also registration is open. So I mentioned before that we are having a First Nations Data Sovereignty and Research Conference called Our Data, Our Truths, Our Voice. It is at the RB Convention Center here in Treaty 1 territory in Winnipeg. And it is 3 days, the January 21st to 23rd. So the hope is to bring communities together, to bring people who are interested to learn about First Nations data, sovereignty, and research. But we do have some workshops, we do have presentations, we do have keynotes. The link registration is open. It is in the chat box. And if you have any questions, you could send it to our email, ourdata2025@fnism.com. And I don't see no questions further. So with that, I thank you so much for joining us. For those that joined in on the webinar, thank you so much, Heather, Krystal, Floyd. Truly appreciate it. A lot of wisdom, a lot of knowledge shared. And that's what we wanted. So with that, I wish everyone a great day. Take care, everyone. And thank you for joining us.